welcome. Okay, so I'm not going to say a lot about paradoxes in this talk. Although this is a conference on paradoxes, and although what I'm doing is motivated entirely by an application to paradoxes in ways that I will try to make clear and explain. In fact, there's a lot of details to go through, a lot of things to work through, that's sort of groundworky stuff. And I actually think the paradoxes are going to be pretty easy to handle at the end of this. We should just be able to just sprinkle them on top, and it should be pretty straightforward. I don't know that yet, though, so I'm not promising you it will be straightforward to just sprinkle them on top at the end. That's my hope and belief. But there are some interesting problems in substructural logic and in relations between substructural logics and classical logic that arise in the course of thinking about the paradoxes and that need to be sorted out and settled before we can ask how they interact with the paradoxes. And so this talk is going to really focus on that groundwork, on these problems that are of concern because of the paradoxes, but that don't themselves involve the paradoxes. Okay, so suppose you think, and I'm not going to say anything about what it is to be the right logic here. I have all kinds of things to say about it, but I will stop myself from saying so that I can say the things that I have time to say. But suppose you think that in some sense, the right logic, whatever that means, is not classical logic. And this is something that many people think for reasons that have to do with the paradoxes. Many people think it for many other reasons, but I'm most interested here in applications to do with the paradoxes. You run in immediately to what I think of first and foremost as an explanatory problem. Right, if classical logic is wrong, why does it work so well for so many things? Right? It's I think undisputable that classical logic has a variety of applications in which it is an excellent tool for the job. And one way to explain why it is so widely applicable is to say, well, it's in fact universally applicable, right? It's such an excellent tool for all these many jobs because it's in fact this universal tool. It will work for anything. And once you adopt the non-classical logic for some purpose, you give up the possibility of offering that explanation of classical logic success, right? I take it that's the usual classical logicians, not in the sense of someone who does classical logic, but in the sense of someone who believes it's the one true logic. That's their usual explanation of its success, right? It works so well because it's in fact getting at the truth about capital L logic. And you cannot give that explanation if you think that it's not getting at the truth about capital L logic. And this leaves an explanatory problem. You need some other explanation of why it's worked so well. And this is how I understand the desire for what's often called classical recapture. When people are engaged in projects of classical recapture, what I think they're doing, or what I think they ought to be doing, is attempting to answer this explanatory question. Why has classical logic worked so well, even though it's wrong? And so you can see, I won't go through many examples. The whole paper is focused on one particular example, but just as another example that's not the one I'm going to focus on to get the flavor. For those folks who were around for the talks JC's given over the past few days, where he's talking about logic, okay, that's non-classical, but then you have these theory-specific consequence relations, and for JC, many of those theory-specific consequence relations will extend classical logic. And so its success is to be explained in this theory-specific way, theory by theory, right? It works so well as a logic of whatever it works for, because it is in fact a correct logic of whatever that restricted domain is. It's just not universal in these kinds of ways. So that's, as I see it, one way of answering this explanatory question. Okay, the way I'm going to focus on, though, is not that way at all. It's a different way of answering the explanatory question. As I'm no historian of 21st century ideas, this one goes at least back to the 20th century, at least to the lovely time of the 70s. This idea that the idea is at least as old as my shirt. And right, because it's in Anderson and Belknap, it's in Entailment 1. And this is the idea that in some sense, classical logic, the connectives of classical logic are ambiguous in a certain way, right? They can be cashed out in different ways. They There are different meanings underlying this single connective. And at least some of the problems that classical logic seems to run us into, according to Anderson and Belknap, arise from equivocation over this ambiguity, arise from failing to recognize this ambiguity going through. I won't engage with the idea in the exact way Anderson and Belknap develop it. Instead, I'm going to engage with it in the way that Francesco Paoli has developed it more recently, over the past several years. And in particular, I'm going to focus on an article by Ed Maris and Francesco Paoli, in which they make this claim, I think, as precise as I have seen it made in their present context. So that's the thing. I want to look at that background for classical recapture. So here's, on the handout, first couple of quotes. One's from an earlier Paoli paper, and then two are from this sort of Maris and Paoli development that I'll be focusing on. First thing, Paoli says, classical logic is not so much wrong if by this word we mean that it ascribes disputable properties to the logical constants it deals with, as ambiguous. Its connectives are ill-defined in as much as they have multiple meanings. This is a statement, a direct statement of what I'll call the ambiguity thesis. And note what he's saying, classical logic isn't wrong on this view, right? We are to explain its success by its correctness, right? But although it's correct, we have to figure out what it's saying to see the ways in which it's correct, because it's saying the correct thing in an ambiguous way, right? So it's, in some ways, it's ambiguous between things that are correct and things that are not correct is the idea. The problems come from interpreting it in the ways that are not correct, but really everything it's saying is correct, properly understood, properly disambiguated. So a second quote, this is from the Maris and Paoli paper. There is no need to give up any compelling inferential principle of classical logic, only to recognize that bad things can happen when principles holding of different connectives are used in the course of a derivation as holding of the same ambiguous connective. And this is now pointing to the role that equivocation is meant to play in here, right? Equivocation over this ambiguity. And then finally, and this is, I think, one of the clearest statements of this view, we do not maintain that there are invalid inferential principles in classical propositional logic. If properly disambiguated, all laws of classical logic can be salvaged in LL, by which they mean a particular formulation of linear logic. We'll take a look at that. Now, linear logic is, in some sense, a subclassical logic. And they are, in the course of this paper, endorsing it. So to see them say, we do not maintain that there are invalid inferential principles in classical logic is very surprising, because here they are endorsing a, in some sense, weaker than classical logic. And so I think it's important for their project to be very, very precise about how it is that they can mean this and about what it is that they mean. And I actually think when you follow through the details of the way they suggest cashing this out, it just doesn't work. That said, I think there's a very, very near neighbor that's going to work. And so that's going to be the thrust of where we're going. I want to first show you that the way they propose making this precise doesn't work, and then with whatever time is left, at least wave at the nearby neighbor that I think can do a better job. Okay, so that's the framing. Now we just got to get some squiggles around so that we have something to play with, because that's the fun part. So I'm going to work with two different propositional languages. This is entirely within propositional logic, not because the quantifiers don't matter, they absolutely do, but in fact, because wheeling the quantifiers in here, this is hard enough, at least for me. Like the quantifiers are going to cause all kinds of extra trouble. This project does not get easier when you bring the quantifiers in, and what I'm going to say about the propositional language very much does not suffice to settle things going on with the quantifiers. That's hard, it's a separate thing. So I'm just going to be fully propositional today. So we're going to look with two different propositional languages. One of them, they're going to have the same atomic sentences, I'll use P, Q, R, whatever. One of them on the handout is called LC, this is the classical language. And I'm going to do a sort of sparse formulation of these languages. So what do you have? You have atoms, you have negations of things that you have. You have this constant, which I'm going to write as a sort of blackboard bold 1, which is just a truth constant in the language, and you have this conjunction. And you should understand disjunctions and implications and whatever, all is defined out of this in the usual sort of way. You could do it with the full formulation, but then it wouldn't fit on one sheet of paper for the handout. So we're doing it this way. But the difference between defining them up and taking them as primitive, that really doesn't matter for anything we're doing. I'm just doing that to save ink and space. The other language is the linear language. It has the same stock of atoms. It also has negations in it. But where classical logic has one truth constant, classical language has one truth constant, the linear language has two truth constants. So there's one, this is the sort of top, that I will call the additive truth constant, or the additive variant, and the other, the little t, which I'll call the multiplicative truth constant. And similarly, where the classical language has one conjunction, the linear language has two conjunctions. One, which I've written there with the staple, would be the additive conjunction, and the other one, the O times, is the multiplicative conjunction. And so this is why it's a bit difficult to say that linear logic is a subclassical logic, right? Because in fact, classical logic works in the classical language, linear logic works in the linear language. So, right, comparing strings of logics that actually operate in different languages is a non-trivial problem. And this is where the core Mersenne-Pauli idea hits, right? This is where it works. It uses this slack in the service of this classical recapture. And I actually think that slack can be used in the service of classical recapture, which is not the way they do it. Now, just like you can define a falsum from your verum in the classical language, and you can define a disjunction or implication from your conjunction and negation in the classical language, you can do all that in the linear language too. But because we have this duplication between additive and multiplicative, that extends. So just like you have an additive and multiplicative truth constant, using negation, you will get an additive and a multiplicative falsity constant. Similarly, additive and multiplicative conjunctions will give you additive and multiplicative disjunctions, additive and multiplicative implications. But you should understand those definitions as being just your familiar kind of De Morgan-y definitions. Any particular way you want to do it will work out. This is the linear setting we're working in is classical enough where those inner definitions are just going to work kind of any familiar way you want to do them. But they do preserve this additive multiplicative distinction. So we have a kind of duplication of all our connectives except for negation. Negation is just negation. This is the alleged ambiguity. Right, the alleged ambiguity, when they say, for example, take when Pauli in the first quote says, the connectives have multiple meanings, that is, the connectives of classical logic have multiple meanings, this is what he means. He means that this conjunction connected in the classical language is ambiguous between the additive conjunction of the linear language and the multiplicative conjunction of the linear language. And in fact, the constants are around me even for technical purposes, but I encourage you, if this is in any way not already second nature to you, just ignore the constants. The real action is going to be in the binary connective. That's what we care about here. That's where the work is. The constants do matter. There's a reason they're there, but like, let's just forget about it and think about the binary connectives. Similarly, right, classical disjunction is meant to be ambiguous between additive and multiplicative disjunction. Classical implication is meant to be ambiguous between additive and multiplicative implication. This is the idea. The binary connectives of classical logic are ambiguous in this way. So, getting more and more precise. Now, got to tell you something about what these things mean. Right? If the alleged ambiguity is between these two different meanings, well, we should figure out what those two different meanings are. And these here we've got some options. So what you've got in the third box on your handout is a proof system. If you take every rule in there, this is a proof system for what's called affine logic. And if you remove the boxed rule, the dilution rule, it's a proof system for linear logic. So you have two different proof systems in that third box, right? One contains everything, and then one of them is just cut out the dilution rule, the weakening rule. Important things to note about this. One, the identity, those initial sequence are restricted to atoms. You'll get the same consequence relation out, whichever way you go here, but it's important for reasons I'll flag when we get to them. Second thing to note, these sequence involve multisets on either side of the sequence separator. So order doesn't matter, but number of occurrences very much does. So the logics that we get out of this, affine logic and linear logic, very importantly, are not closed under the rule of contraction. So here's a left contraction rule, right? And so what does this left contraction rule say? It says, well, if an argument is valid with two occurrences of some premise in it, then the corresponding argument that just has one is also valid. Or if you think of a sequent derivation as showing you how to justify the argument at the bottom of it by tracing the justification back to the leaves, which are sort of easily justified because they just say that P entails P, then what this tells you is that as you're looking for a justification for this, you're allowed to duplicate your premise. Yeah, and there's a corresponding rule for the conclusion that would allow you to duplicate conclusions in that way on the way back for search or contract them coming down. The linear logic and affine logic are not closed under these rules. It's not only not a rule of the system, it's not derivable, it's not admissible. These rules are very importantly absent. And this is what enables them to deal with the paradoxes. You can add a transparent truth predicate to either of these logics and everything will work out completely fine. As I give you this, cut's admissible over this kind of system. If you add a transparent truth predicate, cut remains admissible over this kind of system. The absence of cut is just to make these things easy to work with. But you could impose a cut rule here and still the same would be true. If you add a transparent truth predicate, everything would work out just fine. So in this kind of system, we don't need to know the details, but this is what shows us the difference between an additive and a multiplicative conjunction. So remember, we need to keep track of numbers of occurrences now of things because contraction fails. So having two, it really is different from having one. In affine logic, where we can, so affine logic, this dilution rule, just like this allows you to duplicate as you go up. Affine logic allows you to throw things away as you go up. So in affine logic, having more is always stronger because if you want less, you could just throw away what you have. But in linear logic, that's not so. Right, in linear logic, you have what you have. You can't duplicate any of it, you can't throw any of it away. And so more is not really a terribly useful way to think about it. Anyway, we gotta keep track of numbers of occurrences. So what's an additive conjunction? What is the additive conjunction of, how did I lose a marker? It's on the chair? Ah, awesome, thank you very much. There aren't many places. So what's the additive conjunction of A with B? You should think of this one occurrence of this additive conjunction. You should think of it as a thing that if you look at it one way, it's an occurrence of A. And if you look at it another way, it's an occurrence of B. Right, it's one thing, it's only one occurrence, but it could be an A or it could be a B. And if you've seen the very famous cover photo of later editions of the Hofstadter's Gödel-Escher-Bach book with the G and the E and the B all carved into the woodblock from different angles, that's an additive conjunction, right? That's what that is. If you look at it one way, it's a G. If you look at another way, it's an E. If you look at another way, it's a B, but it's only one thing, right? It's not, you can't get a G and an E out of it. You would need two of them. Yeah, you need to look at one like it's a G and another one like it's an E. That's what the additive conjunction is. And you can see that in the rules. So take a look, for example, at the additive conjunction on the left rule. You should take that slash to mean that could be either an A or a B, but it's got to be exactly one of them. What that tells you, it says, okay, when can I get an argument to be valid coming from an additive conjunction, you know, with some other stuff? Well, look, if an A would have done it, the additive conjunction will do it. And if B would have done it, then an additive conjunction will do it, right? It's the sort of thing that can stand in for an A as a premise, and it can stand in for a B as a premise, right? It can serve either role. And similarly, if you look at the right rule for it, what does it take to establish an additive conjunction? Well, you need some context, some gamma delta, some premises and conclusion that suffice to establish an A, and you need that same context to suffice to establish a B. And then that very context suffices to establish one of these things. Why is that? Well, if you want to use this thing as an A, well, then you go to your context, which you know will give you an A. And if you want to use this thing as a B, then you go to your context, which you know will give you a B. So there's no need to combine different contexts here, right? This is because the additive conjunction is this one thing. Multiplicative conjunction, very different critter. The multiplicative conjunction of A with B, how should you think of that? That's a pair. One of these is an A together with a B, right? It's a box, and you open the box, and there's one A in there, and there's also one B in there. And that's a different thing, right? And you can see this again in the rules. So if you look at the left rule, when can you draw on this as a premise? Well, exactly when you can draw on an A together with a B as a premise. Right? It's a different kind of rule. This one, you need one or the other. This one, you need them both. And similarly, you can see it in the right rule. What does it take to get an A multiplicatively conjoined to a B? Well, you need some things, gamma and delta, that will give you an A. And you need some other things, gamma prime and delta prime, that will give you a B. And then you have to take all of those together. You need to combine all those things. And they will give you an A times B. So this is the difference in underlying things. Classically, these are equivalent. If you add a rule of contraction and a rule of dilution to this system, you can go back and forth between these very, very freely. I won't look at the details of that. But classically, these are completely equivalent. In linear logic, they're independent of each other. In affine logic, the multiplicative conjunction is stronger than the additive, but they're still not equivalent. It's stronger than the additive basically because we have dilution. Remember, dilution allows us to throw things away. So if I have a pair of an A and a B, I want to look at it as an A. I want to use it as an A with a B, an A additively conjoined to a B. I want to look at this pair as an A, well, I throw out the B and keep the A. And if I want to look at this pair as a B, well, I throw out the A and keep the B. That requires being able to throw things out. So in linear logic where you can't throw things out, they really are independent of each other. They're different sorts of critters. So that's the alleged ambiguity. Let's take a look now at what we want to do in the classical language. Here's 4 proof systems for the classical language, resulting in 3 different consequence relations. Again, the details of these are not super important, but everything I do is basically a cry for help, but I want to make a cry for help very explicit here. If anyone recognizes the proof system I'm calling NOD, or no-D for no dilution, or recognizes the consequence relation that it determines, please, please, please tell me. I want to know more about this system. But anyway, so here's what we got down here. It's a whole mess of rules. Ignore the boxes for now. Where do these rules come from? Well, if you compare the affine logic box to the classical logic box, you'll see the rules are just copied down, right? The rules are exactly the same, except where the box with the proof systems for the linear language uses an additive conjunction, we have just the classical conjunction down below, and where the initial box uses the multiplicative conjunction, we also have the classical conjunction down below. So this is the sort of all the rules for everything kind of collapsed. And the same is true for the constants, but as I said, I encourage you to ignore the constants. Unless you're fascinated by them, in which case let's talk about them. But like for the narrative thread of the talk, I really encourage you to ignore the constants. Okay, so this whole mess of rules, where do they come from? They really are just what you would get by squinting at the earlier rules. And if you take that whole mess together, you get a system I'll call G3C+. It determines classical logic exactly. It's just familiar classical consequence relation. It's a bit of a weird proof system for classical logic, but it is classical logic. If you get rid of these single box rules there, you get a system that I'm calling G3C star. It's super, super close to the well-known system G3C. Which also determines classical logic, and indeed G3C star does also determine classical logic, right? In fact, G3C plus and G3C star are even more intimately related than that. They have the very same derivable rules as each other, which is as tight a connection as you can get between 2 sequence systems short of identity. So really, those differences matter kind of internally, but you don't need to keep track of them. But what happens when you get rid of this dilution rule, which we need to think about because we're thinking about linear logic, which doesn't have dilution? Things differ. Now the presence and absence of the single box rules matters. So if you keep the single box rules but get rid of dilution, you get the system I'm calling NOD, for no dilution. And like I say, NOD, I'm really, really interested in NOD. If you know anything about it, please tell me. And if you get rid of all the box rules, now you have this system called NOD minus. I would also like to know stuff about NOD minus, but it's so weird that maybe I care less. I don't know. It's going to be less motivated as well. So anyway, NOD and NOD minus determine distinct consequence relations from each other and from classical logic. So we have 3 different consequence relations here on the classical language. G3C plus and G3C star just are classical logic. They're a bit unorthodox as proof systems, but they do give you just normal classical logic. Okay. Ready to flip over. Now we've got enough in play so that we can see what Mayers and Pauli say about how to understand the ambiguity claim. Remember, we had this ambiguity claim. It seems surprising. They say nothing classically valid is invalid, even though we endorse linear logic. And they tell us how to make this claim precise, right? They appeal to what they call the Grisham-Ono translations between these sorts of logics. The bit of history here, Grisham made some translations. They worked to connect affine logic to classical logic. Ono modified them so that they would work to connect linear logic to classical logic. So when they call them the Grisham-Ono translations, they're acknowledging that history. For our purposes here, the difference between what Grisham did and what Ono did is important. So I will talk about the Grisham translations and the Ono translations. Right, these are just separate translations, although as you'll see, they're incredibly similar. Right, so what we have, each of them gives us a positive and a negative translation, and these are kind of disambiguating translations. These go from the classical language to the linear language, and they disambiguate things in a different way. So you've got them there on your handout. Taking a look at the first two columns, these are the negative and positive Grisham translations. You see atoms just get left alone, and the truth constant and the conjunction go multiplicative in the negative translation, and they go additive in the positive translation. And what does negation do? Well, negation gets translated as negation, but it also hands things back and forth between the two translations. Right, so the negative translation of a negation is the negation of the positive translation of the negatum, and vice versa. The Ono translations are exactly the same, except for the atoms. Right, the Ono translations translate the atoms as well. They don't leave the atoms alone like the Grisham translations do, and so in negative contexts, it's multiplicative verum additively conjoined to the atom, and in positive contexts, it's multiplicative fulsum additively disjoined to the atom. And here's why these things matter. I've called them old facts on your handout. These are known facts, and this is, in particular, the Ono fact is what Mayers and Pauli are explicitly appealing to. So here's the Grisham fact. An argument is classically valid if and only if the negative translation of its premises entails the positive translation of its conclusions in affine logic, right, where we do impose weakening in the underlying logic on the linear language. And then what Ono shows is that, in fact, if you, by messing with the atoms in these ways, you don't need the weakening. You can get the corresponding fact from classical logic to linear logic without any weakening in the underlying logic by tinkering with the atoms in that way. And the reason that works, every formula in the image of the Ono translations is such that weakening for it is derivable in linear logic. Even though weakening full stop isn't, these multiplicative constants have the right properties, and the additive connectives work those properties in the right way, such that every formula in the image of the Ono translations is weakenable. That is, if it's in the image of the negative translation, it's weakenable on the left, and if it's in the image of the positive translation, it's weakenable on the right. That's why the atom messing with is there. And to prove these facts, particularly the Grisham fact, where you don't need to worry about atoms, it's incredibly straightforward. You just take your proof of take your classical derivation, in particular in the system G3C star, and apply the negative translation to everything on the left, apply the positive translation to everything on the right, and what will you get popping out the other end is a proof in affine logic of the corresponding thing, right? So if you notice, so G3C star is the one minus the boxed rules, right? It's the one where you can only introduce a conjunction on the right additively, and you can only introduce a conjunction on the left multiplicatively. But that's exactly what the Grisham translations tell you to do. They say if you have a conjunction on the left, it's multiplicative, and if you have a conjunction on the right, it's additive. So when you disambiguate in this way, lo and behold, the rules are right there. They're exactly, the underlying affine logic rules are exactly what you need. And so what Mayers and Pauli say is that this is how to understand their claim, particularly that what I'm calling the Ono old fact. That's how to understand their claim that classical logic is ambiguous and that it has no invalid principles. It's that if properly disambiguated, with proper disambiguation running according to the Ono translation, you can see that every classically valid argument is valid in this way, and in fact, it gets them all. Okay. One problem with this way of thinking, now I'm going to tell you why that's wrong. One problem with this way of thinking has to do with the constants, but like I said, let's ignore those. So here are the two problems I want to look at. One of them has to do with the atoms. The ambiguity thesis is about connectives. There's no alleged ambiguity in any atoms. It is no part of the ambiguity thesis story that the atom P is ambiguous between multiplicative top additively conjoined to P and multiplicative fulsum additively disjoined to P. Like, that's just not part of the picture. The story is about connectives. And so, using the Grisham translations maybe can be motivated, although I'll come back to that. But it leaves the atoms alone, and that's what we should expect. There's no reason to expect any ambiguity in these atomic sentences. But using the Ono translations is totally unmotivated, because in fact we're disambiguating in this way. Now, last time I gave this talk, Thomas convinced me I needed to push harder here. And I think there's a problem that may be even deeper than unmotivation, which is there's a potential of a, maybe not hugely vicious, but at least worrisome regress here, right? Because if P itself is ambiguous, well then surely multiplicative verum additively conjoined to P is also ambiguous, because after all, it contains the ambiguous P. And so on and so on and so on and so on, right? And so you end up actually, if you really endorse the ambiguity claim, even for atoms, which Merton-Pelly do not, but if you were to try to bite this bullet, you would end up having to say that every atomic sentence is not only infinitely ambiguous, but undisambiguatable. And that strikes me as, given that there's no motivation here at all to say any of this strikes me as really not the way to go. The motivation to say this is because they want to appeal to the Ono translation. Right, and of course, appealing to the Ono translation, you do get this formal connection to classical logic, but it just doesn't fit the ambiguity story. The formal fact they're citing does not fit with the philosophical setting they put it in. They do consider this worry, and they have a response. It's a very brief response, but they have it. They say, look, and this is now in the next box, they say, if we confine ourselves to the classical tautologies that play a role in the known versions of the paradoxes, then you do not need to replace propositional variables in order to get to a theorem of linear logic, right? So they admit that you do to get to full classical logic. So this is in a way giving up the classical recapture attempt and saying, look, we don't need to recapture all of classical logic. All we owe you an explanation for is the problematic paradoxical principles that we're seemingly rejecting, right? It's just those we need to recapture. We don't need to recapture all of classical logic. And I think there's questions here about whether that would in fact suffice or not. But it doesn't matter whether it would suffice or not because it's false. So here surely is a classical principle that is known to be problematic with respect to paradoxes. It's just error contraction. Right? If there are classical principles known to be problematic for paradoxes, this has surely got to be on the list. But disambiguating this with the Grisham translation will not give you a validity of linear logic. Yeah, right. So the claim they make, whether or not it would suffice if it were true, doesn't matter. It's false. Similarly, in the same boat, you can put, and the difference between this theorem form and the argument form here doesn't matter. I'm just doing it because they've decided to phrase things in terms of tautologies rather than in terms of valid arguments. But the argument also doesn't get translated to a valid argument. Similarly, pseudomodus ponens, right? Also known to be problematic principle to do with the paradoxes, classically valid, but does not get translated via the Grisham translations to a theorem of linear logic. And so I assume what they have in mind is excluded middle and explosion. Those do get translated to classically valid principles. Even the forms with conjunctions and disjunctions in them do get translated to valid principles. But their approach is solving the paradoxes non-contractively. So the principles we're worried about are the contraction-associated ones like these. And that's precisely what they fail to recapture. So we don't need to worry about whether their response would be successful if it worked, because it depends on a false claim. The second problem with this approach, so that's a problem for using the Ono translations. The second problem with their approach, though, applies to the Grisham and Ono translations equally. And it's that ambiguity just doesn't have anything at all to do with positive and negative occurrences. Like, ambiguity is a real thing that happens. We know a lot about ambiguity. We have many paradigm examples of ambiguity in the world. And none of them is sensitive to positive and negative occurrence in this way. So if I say the word bat, it's ambiguous between a kind of animal and a kind of sporting equipment. And if I say, hey, I really like bats, I've said something ambiguous. You might wonder, does he like the animal? Does he like the sporting equipment? What's going on? But there's no way that you would think, okay, when we draw on I really like bats as a premise, then it's about animals. But when we reach it as a conclusion, then it's about sporting equipment. And then if it's negated, those roles swap. And then if it's like, this is just not how ambiguity works at all. And this, I think there's just this really deep problem at the core of the way they developed this thesis. The ambiguity just does not fit with this whole positive-negative translation pattern. There's nothing in any familiar case of ambiguity that depends on polarity of occurrence. But these translations depend crucially on polarity of occurrence. So even if you forget about the atom problem, I think this way of developing the ambiguity story simply does not fit the ambiguity story. And the technical facts just do not fit the philosophical story. Okay, so I've been going for about 40 minutes, a little less than 40 minutes, is that right? Okay, sweet. So where do we end up? Well, here's where I think is a better version of the story, a better way forward. And I do think this is very much a version of the story, right? I'm offering yet another variant on what I see as the Anderson-Belknap tradition, but what for all I know may go back before that. Right? I mean, and this is, you will note that what I'm about to say is very, very similar to the things I've just been arguing against. Right? This is why my arguments against them went into the woods and the details, is because I think the problems with what they're saying are in the woods and in the details. The gist is really right on. And so what I'm going to try to offer you now in the last few minutes is a way of developing that gist where the formal facts appealed to actually fit the philosophical story that's in play. And in order to do that, I'm going to need to actually change both the philosophical story and the formal facts appealed to bring them into some kind of harmony with each other. But that's the idea. So here's the version of the story I want to tell. Classical logic, the classical language is not in any way ambiguous, right? It's not that, okay, sometimes when we say and, we mean additive and, but other times we mean multiplicative and, right? Because of course that's what ambiguity would be. But that's not what's happening at all. The version of the story I want to tell, what we're doing with a classical conjunction is running these two things together, conflating them, ignoring the difference between them, treating them as though the difference didn't matter. That, I think, it's fair enough to say, is basically another way of spelling out the gist going on, right? It's very much, it's going to enable all kinds of thinking about equivocation. That's what equivocation is, right? Is running things together and then reasoning across it. Some things being ambiguous might explain sometimes why we would conflate them if we don't recognize an ambiguity. But ambiguity isn't really part of the conflation story. The idea here is that in every use of this classical conjunction, both of these meanings are present. Not that it's sometimes one and sometimes the other. Right? This is what conflation is to ignore the difference between things. And so those things are just kind of always there in some way getting dragged around. And so I've elsewhere given a formal treatment of conflation. And what I want to do is pick it up and apply it right here. I'll say a tiny little bit to motivate it, but really the developing and motivating this treatment is a separate project. So I'm more or less just going to try to kind of plug it in here and appeal to it. We can absolutely talk about it in Q&A, of course, if anyone's interested in hearing more about that. Here's the story I want to give about validity in languages that exhibit conflation. Let's say a language is valid in, an argument is valid in this conflated language, if and only if it has some valid unconflated counterpart. Right, that's valid in whatever the underlying language is that's being conflated together into this one. And this is motivated essentially by two desiderata. The first is one that I'm picking up from Joseph Camp's book, Confusion, which is on what I'm calling conflation. It's on a similar topic. And it's a desiderata that he calls inferential charity. And the idea behind inferential charity is in some ways, you don't want to count a conflated, so say someone's reasoning in a conflated language. You don't want to be able to say their argument's invalid just because it happens to contain a conflation, right? You want to be able to hold their arguments to the same standards that you would normally hold arguments to. That is to give them, say, okay, well, note that you've conflated something. That might itself be a mistake. I don't think it always is, but maybe it is at least this time, or maybe it is sometimes. But even still, that now when we evaluate the validity of your reasoning, that's a separate question, right? It's not the sort of thing, we don't want the validity of your reasoning to be undermined just because, hey, there's this conflated thing rolling around in it. That's the sort of motivation that Camp gives. I think there's an additional motivation that you can give, which is simply that what conflation is ignoring a distinction. It's blurring a distinction. It's not attending to a distinction. But what distinctions do is undermine validity. Right? That's why we draw distinctions. Someone gives an argument, you say, wait, that's too fast because you're running together these two things. Distinctions are about separating, or about pulling things apart, or about breaking validities. And so conflations do the reverse. They're about getting rid of distinctions, and so they're only going to make more things valid. You're not going to, by conflating something, undermine its validity. So here are two reasons why I think we should think, at the very least, that will give you the right to left direction of the biconditional I've given you, right? If there's some valid unconflated counterpart, then we should count the conflated thing as valid. Yeah. Why the left to right direction? Basically because I don't see any other way for an argument in a conflated language to be valid. Why else should it be valid? We don't want to be calling things valid willy-nilly here. Right, so you say, okay, well, one way it gets to be valid is by having a valid unconflated counterpart, and there isn't any other way, so here's the biconditional. And anyway, that's the story. Like I said, we can dig more into that if you're interested. So in this case, we've got this map beta that I gave you in the box on the top of the second page, and beta is just the simple-minded collapse map. Beta goes from the linear language to the classical language, and it just says, I don't care about the additive multiplicative difference. I'm just going to collapse it that way. And this is just what you need. The idea of the formal treatment of conflation that I give depends on having a relation between languages. And this is a function, but a function's a relation, so it'll work just fine in terms of guiding us as to what an unconflated counterpart is in this sense. And now here are some new facts. And these are the ones that I think matter. And the first new fact is that an argument is classically valid if and only if there's some multisets in the linear language such that that argument between them is affinely valid, and when conflated, they give you the original classical argument. Right? So if we see the classical conjunction, the classical connectives in general, as conflating their linear language counterparts, and we think that validity in the linear language is affine validity, then we have, I think, a very straightforward sense in which no valid argument in classical logic goes wrong. They're all correct, right? They're all in fact valid in this conflated language because they have some sort of genuinely valid unconflated counterpart. And that's, I think, the best way to sell this kind of story. Now, Mears and Pauli, and Pauli himself in other work where he's concerned about the ambiguity, don't actually endorse affine logic, they endorse linear logic. And so cannot take advantage of that sort of fact, right? That fact doesn't fit with what they're up to. So you might naturally wonder, well, suppose we're taking this conflation story on board, but we think that just real underlying validity is linear validity. Where do we end up? And the answer is we end up with not, this weird system that I want to know more about. So you've got that second new fact, which is, okay, so maybe we don't get classical recapture for the linear theorist this way, but we get nod recapture. And you know, that's not, well, how good or bad that is depends on what nod's like. And as I said, I don't really know a heck of a lot about it. Yeah. You get interesting things in it. You get conjunctions, it's reflexive, conjunctions entail their conjuncts, and distributes over or. None of these things are true in nod minus. But in nod, you get these sorts of things. But exactly what it's like I say, for me, I want to know more. It's an open sort of question. And the proof of those facts is basically exactly the same, right? Well, it's interesting. So suppose you have an affine or a linear derivation. You apply this beta map to it everywhere. You just collapse everything through it. And you end up with a derivation in the appropriate system for the classical language. That happens. The fun part is going the other way, right? Because where the Grisham and Ono translations imagine a once and for all disambiguation of everything. What we need to do in this case is actually something more interesting. We need to do a derivation by derivation, occurrence by occurrence, or really thread by thread disambiguation. Not disambiguation in the sense, right, given the philosophical setting, this is going to be a deconflation. But we're going to be saying, look, here the conjunction's being used additively, here the conjunction's being used multiplicatively. And the reason you can always get away with this, you have to be sensitive to how it's used, but there's always some way to do it, is because no rule anywhere in these proof systems requires any occurrence of a connective to match any other occurrence of a connective. So you have a free hand with each occurrence to make it what you want it to be. Because there's nothing requiring matching. If you think about usual proof systems, where do they require complex formulas to match other complex formulas? In the initial sequence, in those identity sequence, but we restricted those to atoms. This is where that restriction matters. Right, so okay, we require atoms to match atoms, but there's no connectives there to worry about. In a rule of cut, where the cut formula has to be the same coming in from one side and coming in the other, but these are cut-free systems. So there's no rule of cut, we don't need to worry about that. and in the rule of contraction, where these have to be two occurrences of the same formula to get contracted down to one. But we don't have any rule of contraction. So in these proof systems, they've been rigged up so that we never have to care about whether two formulas are the same or not in order to apply a rule. And that's what gives us the free hand in disambiguating everything as we go back. We can make this one multiplicative and that one additive, and although they may have happened to match before, nothing would depend on their matching. So it's fine to make them not match. So quick summary of the results here down at the bottom. You got a little chart. Suppose you think you want to use the Grisham plus minus translations, which is, I think, at least fixes the atom problem, but still runs into the positive and negative translation problem. If you think underlying validity is linear, you end up at not minus, which is, like I say, this bizarre system. It's reflexive on atoms, but it's not reflexive. And so it doesn't obey uniform substitution, and conjunctions don't entail their conjuncts, and distribution is the not minus. It's weird. But that's where you end up. If you start from affine logic and do that sort of thing, you end up at G3C star. Perfectly normal, sensible looking proof system that does in fact determine classical logic. On the other hand, if you use this conflation story based around this collapse translation rather than the T's apart, if you start linearly, you end up at nod, which is, at least to me, unfamiliar, but seems sort of better behaved than nod minus. And again, you end up classically at affine logic. So the story they give, that is the formal development of the story they give, just doesn't fit the sales pitch. At all. If it recaptures anything, it recaptures nod minus, and nod minus is not the sort of thing that should make anyone happy if they think that the explanatory project of classical recapture is an important project, because nod minus fails to recapture all kinds of classically important things, including things crucially involved in the paradoxes. If you go the conflation route, but you stay linear, well, you get nod. Better, but you're still not actually recapturing classical logic. On the other hand, if you think dilution really is in play for the underlying language, now you can get a real proper classical recapture solution here, where the formal facts actually fit the story given, if the story given is done in terms of conflation. Now, how does this all play with truth? Just to close, and like I flagged at the beginning, this is speculative. I think it's basically going to be pretty straightforward with truth. I think actually if you put naive truth rules through this, it should just basically go right through. There's details about the naming that need to be messed with, because of course you're naming things in two different languages, so you can't hold your naming device constant as you go back and forth because they're naming different things. But I believe that it should be pretty straightforwardly finessable here. So you can imagine adding transparent truth rules to all of these systems. And as I say, I believe that should more or less work out, although the details remain to be seen. But yeah, that's the picture. Thanks much.
Questions? So I'm not sure about this example, but it's something that came to mind when you were talking. So imagine that we want to introduce some definitions in language, like we want to have theory and stuff. And for instance, we want to define when it is to be single. And so we say, oh, let's add the biconditional X is single if only if X is not married.
Okay.
Right, and that's a definition. As a classical logician, I mean, I think that the definition is perfectly fine. You might tell me, no, you shouldn't do definitions like this, maybe. But let's say that for now. And
sure.
Then let's assume, well, modus ponens doesn't work. Let's assume that doesn't happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, even though I do have a biconditional between S and not N, I cannot go anymore from S of Dave to not married Dave.
Because
right?
you don't have modus ponens for that condition, sure.
And vice versa. So I broke the link between S and not N, in the sense that I cannot derive one from the other, mm-hmm. right? Which I take to be analogous to the broken link between the additive and the multiplicative conjunction in this case, right? But the link was broken.
I'm not seeing how yet. Can you say more? What's the nature of the analogy?
So if I could derive, if every time you have an occurrence of A additive conjunction B, I could go from there to multiplicative conjunction and vice versa. Then you would say there's no difference between those two conjunctions. Right?
Sure.
Right? and therefore you would conflate them. You would say they're not two conjunctions, there's only one.
Okay,
Right?
sure.
Now,
No system we've looked at enables you to do that, but if we were in a system that did, sure.
exactly. So
Yeah.
the reason why we think these two things are different is because we cannot do that.
Yep.
Right?
Yep, totally.
And we cannot do that because we don't have contraction and weakening together.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
Now, I take my case to be analogous.
Okay.
We end up saying that we have two different concepts here.
Mm-hmm.
The concept of being single and the concept of being not married.
Mm-hmm.
Because we cannot go from one to the other because modus ponens is not there.
Mm-hmm.
But that's wrong. I mean, I wouldn't say that. Do you see what I mean?
I'm
don't think that's a
fine.
concept there.
Let me try to respond and see, and then you can tell me if this is in fact engaging with what you're saying. I totally think the best approximate I could give you of what real validity might be is going to obey this rule. I do not accept a non-contractive theory of anything that I kind of recognize as validity in a usual way. So if the point is just like, hey, because contraction's valid, this distinction's illusory, yeah, I think I probably agree with you. Cool.
That's
But the
one half of it.
okay, what's the other half?
Well, it's hard for me to put it in words nicely because it just came to me. But the other half would be something like, if you think that because a rule like contraction, but could be other, is not valid, you have an ambiguity or a difference in meaning of some kind, then why not thinking that therefore there's a difference in meaning between being single and being not married, because modus ponens is not valid. So for instance,
Sure.
people that reject modus ponens
Yep.
would be, maybe it's not your case, but I'm sure I didn't do it with cut.
Yeah.
Somehow.
Oh yeah, no, totally.
Right?
Yeah, no, you can, I mean, left defining rules and right defining rules.
So
Right,
you-
so anyway,
end up saying
I can tell you how to do it with cut. It will happen. Yep.
You end up saying that certain things that we normally would like to say they have the same meaning do not.
Yep.
Such as intuitive things such as being single and not married that do not have to do with logic anymore. So I'm suspicious of this argument.
Yeah, so I think I completely agree with everything you say, so I'm maybe not understanding how it leads to suspicion. Right, so conflation, when I accuse Thomas of conflating something, he can turn around and accuse me of drawing a spurious distinction.
Yes.
Right, I mean, conflation and Frege puzzles are the same thing, but just seen from the other end. And so the mere structure, right, that we're looking at one of these cases doesn't settle which pole of it is correct. Right, it could easily be that the alleged additive multiplicative distinction is spurious, which is, I think, what you and I think. Or it could be that we're in fact running together these distinct things, right? That it's a very important distinction that our other commitments are leading us to be unable to see. And which of those is the case has to be settled by argument. Right, the mere structure of, okay, there's a distinction here, then it's under dispute whether the distinction tracks anything, just doesn't settle which side of it's correct. Like, I'm totally on board for having that argument, but I feel like I'm not understanding.
I think it's fine. I'm not sure anymore about the example. I have more counterexamples to my example now in mind, so don't.
Okay, yeah, maybe let's follow up after, yeah.
Okay, so.
Okay, okay, I'm trying to remember the question. Dave, as you know, the first time I heard this, I thought, I wanted to know what, Francesco.
Yeah, I still don't know.
Because it does seem really decisive, so as you were going over it again, I was trying to.
I gotta write it up and send it to them so I can find out, but I still haven't. So.
So this isn't an objection, this is me reaching for some sort of defense of their ambiguity reading. This is the best I can do. Sure, you're right, ambiguity in general is insensitive to premise and conclusion position. But logic is special, and this is a case of ambiguity where the context of premise and conclusions matter. I mean, that's what logic is all about. And so the ambiguity here is interesting because it is sensitive to the one or the other. I'm not endorsing this, but that's the best I can do, and it does seem to me like a response. I'm not saying plausible, but it is a viable response to the charge that ambiguity in general, we know so much about it and it doesn't behave that way.
Yeah, I mean, and this is of a piece with your talk on Monday, right? Which is like, hey, there's this distinction that seems to have dropped out of nowhere. Well, we'll say that's the distinction between logic and non-logic. That's what's done it.
Yeah,
logic is different in these sorts of ways, but I mean, but I see it as of a piece with that.
Okay.
And so I guess the initial part of my pushback is I don't. Okay, so here's two pushbacks against that. One is, as a bare claim, it doesn't strike me as terribly plausible. I want to hear something about what logic is and the way ambiguity interacts with it that would actually enable us to see why ambiguity in this case could work that way, even though, because it's not like, oh sure, ambiguity sometimes takes account of premise and conclusion, but it's super rare, so it would be very surprising if this were a case. It's like, no, this is the unique case, if this is right, where it plays with premise and conclusion. So there's got to be some reason for it, if it is ambiguity, and I want a story there before I'm willing to go with it. The other side of the response, I guess this is in the same family of response, is whether we spell it out via ambiguity or conflation, there's nothing in principle that requires it to be these pairs that we're talking about. So in fact, there's been some really interesting recent work in computer science that looks at conflating in a slightly different treatment of conflation. I don't know exactly how it relates to my story, but I hope to know. That looks at, instead of conflating the conjunctions and the disjunctions and the implications, looks at conflating the additives.
No.
And the multiplicatives.
No.
And the implications.
Yeah.
And similarly, you could tell an ambiguity story, right? You could have mentioned another language, not the classical language, right? That instead of conflating across this distinction, or instead of being ambiguous across this distinction, is ambiguous across those distinctions. But your disambiguating translations over here are not going to be premise and conclusion sensitive. So the claim that all logical ambiguity is premise and conclusion sensitive is also not sustainable. So it really is going to make this one case look like a real outlier, I think, to push it. And there would need to be some, like, that's not an argument it doesn't happen, but like, there's got to be something special happening here. And the idea that the way it's been sold, and I think, and I think because people genuinely believe it, it's like, oh, this is just ambiguity again. You know how ambiguity works. Right, the more we go down this road, the less it becomes that. Although maybe there's another story, another way of developing the story over there that is more plausible or something like that. But any way of spelling that out that works won't be, oh, it's just ambiguity. You know how ambiguity works. And I think even all the way back to Anderson and Belknap, that's how this has been sold.
Thanks.
So I have a very naive question. Classical connectives aren't ambiguous per se, aren't they? But it is related with the last question. The ambiguity appears within a practical context, isn't it? Like, for example, as shown here, it has to be with the practical and technical issues. I mean, it rises in the computer science context. So, well, I think that maybe the ambiguity can we can rid of the ambiguity, like stating a context, and well, maybe, well, I mean, it's difficult to me to understand what's the source of the ambiguity.
And maybe it will help to distinguish, as I didn't in the talk, between, so I focused on claims that this formal language of classical logic is ambiguous. But as, not so much in the Mayers and Pauli paper, but as Pauli's developed the claim elsewhere, it's paired with the claim very frequently that natural language connectives, like and or and so on, are also ambiguous in the very same way, ambiguous between these two sorts of things. And I do think that So say, for example, you know, two computer scientists who are working on substructural type systems and they're talking to each other and they're just in this linear setting where like that's what's doing. And yeah, there are, when linear logicians talk out loud, they've developed, they don't say and, they say with or times, precisely to track this sort of thing. But you know, suppose one of them slips and just says and. Well, in that context, that is almost certainly ambiguous in the usual sense, right? I mean, like probably they mean one of them and it just wasn't clear which one they meant and so on. So in that sense, the ambiguity is there. But I think the ambiguity of the classical language, even in those contexts, I don't think you particularly see it, basically because the classical language just isn't in use in those contexts. So yeah, I think I just want to resist the idea that the classical language exhibits any ambiguity at all. And that's even though it's possible that natural language connectives in certain contexts exhibit those ambiguities. I think Pauli thinks that it's totally ordinary, widespread ambiguity between these sorts of meanings, whereas I might think it's more restricted to cases where we're using natural language to track some kind of underlying substructural formalism. But that's all about the natural language side. But yeah, I mean, do you think that the classical language itself needs to be ambiguous? Because the sorts of computer science cases that, at least that I have in mind, are cases where the classical language is just not used at all.
Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know if I could look at my notes and look at you, so.
I'm sure the notes are more pleasant.
I mean, I really like the proposal, but I think our job is to defend kind of Ono and Pauli and all this kind of.
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't think Ono said anything that I've argued against.
Okay, yeah, it's more.
Yeah. Sure, but yes.
So one of your arguments seems to be that ambiguity doesn't work that way.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
But in natural language, sometimes it does. I mean, you do have expressions that are ambiguous and you don't take into consideration for the syntactic feature. Right? An example that linguistics uses in English is the word dog, right? It is, I mean, if you think of it in abstract, it's ambiguous, but of course, when it is, if you know exactly what is the role is playing, whether it's a verb or it's a noun, then you know what word it is. So that would be the kind of ambiguity that would work for them, right? So it is the connective alone doesn't work, but when you see, oh, it's in the context of being on the left, then it's this one on the right. And that would help their case a little bit. I'm saying it's not.
That's a cool idea. That's not something I thought of before. That's really nifty. So okay, but let me just think out loud with it and see where we go, right? So in those, take the case of duck, right? So if you can tell from context, if I say, you know, hey Axel, duck,
yeah,
right? It's probably a command, and then it's probably the verb, and I'm probably not talking about verbs. But this is itself most likely because I can't order you to duck.
You're going to like say,
in the bird sense.
In the answer, just bring in semantics, and so is that what you're?
No, I mean, I don't want to commit to whether it's semantic or syntactic. The distinction here, I just don't know. I wouldn't. Yeah, I just don't know.
Okay.
But whether the problem is semantic or syntactic, right? There's a sense in which in the cases where we have disambiguation via these syntactic sort of features, or if it's semantic or whatever, it's because one of the potentially ambiguous things is not present, would be ungrammatical or wouldn't make semantic sense, or whether it's semantic or syntactic, right? It's because you couldn't have the other one.
But that is exactly what they're saying. What they're saying is that when you have conjunction on the left, one of the interpretation is unavailable, which would be the multiplicative. The
additive would be the one that's unavailable on the left.
Exactly.
For them, yeah.
So that's what they're saying. So it is just like that.
But I don't think they should say that, right? Because in fact, additive conjunctions make perfect sense on the left, right?
What do you mean by perfect sense?
Well, if the real story here, right, is meant to be given by, say, linear logic, right? So linear logic makes all kinds of verdicts about what follows from additive conjunctions, right? In particular, so you know, this is linearly valid. Additive conjunctions entail their conjuncts. So there's nothing blocking us from having from drawing on an additive conjunction as a premise. right? The vocabulary of linear logic is
the classical logician.
yeah, it's right. So
it's a conjunction of the two things. Like when it's said by a classical logician and it's on the left, then we can get
yeah, that would be.
and that doesn't sound
And now, yeah, now I would want to know why,
Yes.
right? Because, yeah, so I think the linguistic cases are really worked by ruling out that the certain things would be not well formed or, well, let's say not well formed to be neutral between syntax and semantics, but some things would be not well formed. But here, this is something, this will never be in the image of either the Grisham or the Ono translation. No matter what argument you start with, you will never reach this one. But this is a perfectly sensible thing to say. So yeah, so that would be, thanks for, like I said, that's not something that I had thought about at all, but I think in the end well, anyway, needs more thought, but that's an initial response.
Can I be added to the list again for a second?
Well, yeah, at the end because we saw.
Yeah, exactly, that's what I'm
I
saying.
think the Professor from
Well, do you mind if I return to the thing I'd asked about?
No, I added the extra thing in because I was hoping you would.
Okay. So, all right, so I had thought.
So let me just flag, last time I gave this talk, Thomas was like, but why not say the atoms are ambiguous? And so that was why I did the extra regressy stuff. Okay.
Yeah, and my motivation was that you've got relevant predication, right? And extensional predication, and there's an ambiguity in the first order language between PA, is relevantly applied or not. So why isn't that reflected in atoms? And I sort of pushed on the Ono translation and said, well, look, that really looks like T implies P. And so what if that is sort of multiplicative or intentional P, and why can't that be good? And your reply was, well, that's an additive operation, so it's not.
And it's also not an implication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in thinking about it, I think I may have made a mistake. Because I think that because T, little t, lollipop P is identical to P, maybe P is the sort of relevant thing, right? And in that case, right, then T additive and P would be sort of a de-intentionalizer, right? That would be your standard P. And it looks like the sequence calculus sort of respects that, right? And so now, let's say, I don't know exactly why Mayers and Paoli fetishize linear logic over affine logic.
It's the paradoxes of implication. It's the standard relevant sort of motivation.
Okay, so let's just say for the sake of argument, it's not well formed out why T and would be a sort of de-intentionalizer. But let's just say now that we add to beta star, and we say that P is ambiguous between relevant P, which is T lollipop P, and de-intentionalized P, which is T additive and P. Then it looks like that embeds for the beta star thing into G3C, one of the filters. That looks like you get weakening.
So let me think through. So let's think what is beta star?
Let's just say that we allow P to be interpreted ambiguously as either T
with P, stable P, whatever.
Or T lollipop P.
Okay, but T lollipop P, as you say, is just P. So
yeah.
So,
but I just wanted to try and
sure.
get a sort of
Sure. But so beta, remember the idea, it goes from the linear language to the classical one, right? It's the collapser.
Yeah.
So now I want to know what is beta star of T with P, little t with P, right? Because according to the suggestion that you're giving,
P,
it's going to be P.
Yeah.
But what's already there, if we're just going to lift what's already there into this, and then we're going to get a different answer as well, right? This already has a beta translation, and the beta translation is going to be 1 and P in this sort of sense.
okay.
So we can't just take what's there and add this kind of clause to it. We need in some way to modify what's there.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't think I would have a problem myself with saying that classical atoms get two different translations. And if you're able to get that sort of with.
But we're collapsing things, right? And so I start from something that draws all these distinctions, and I want to know how to collapse them. I should get a unique answer for how to collapse them, no?
Well, you relevant or intentional or multiplicative P would go to P, and extensional or additive P would go to P.
Right. So, but And it's so we already have this.
Okay, so we've replaced that, because we understand that P doesn't. Yeah, so I mean, I'd say that,
I'm just not
okay.
seeing what would we replace that with.
Okay,
I mean, this surely is a way of cashing out your multiplicative P
okay,
or
so
intentional P
beta
goes to
star
P.
is
right?
P, beta star of P is equal to P unless, right, it begins with it's prepended by T with P, in which case it also goes to P or something like this. Okay,
But yeah, I just don't see how to reconcile
yeah,
these, right? Because the collapse here is just squint at the additive multiplicative distinction, and now we want to make special provision for complexes of a certain form. I mean, I don't suppose we can do that, right? So we say, so basically just cross this out. So we don't in general have, so it's, yeah. So it's not, okay. And now the hypothesis is that if we can get the modification of this right,
yeah,
then when we apply it to the linear language, well, we won't hit not, but we'll make it all the way back to classical.
yeah. Oh. So if you have that beta star, I think it seems because of the way that width gets you weakening, or allows you to sort of throw that in there, that the beta star would get you linear. Yeah, that would get you some. See how to sort of classical logic.
Yeah. So part of what I want to know, so here's a concrete question about nod. Are these equivalent in nod? They're surely classically equivalent. But are they equivalent even in nod? I suspect they will be. No, I suspect they won't be. No, wait. No, they will be equivalent even in nod because we can use conjunction multiplicatively even on the right. That's the difference between nod and nod minus. So if these are equivalent in nod, then I think this modification is going to end up having no effect. We'll end up at the same place. Right, because we've turned the P into, we've turned this complex into this simple, but they were already equivalent in the target language. So the change, I think, will have no effect.
All right.
I mean, like, obviously this is not any kind of proof, but my suspicion is that will in fact leave us in just the same place, that we'll be spinning our wheels. And that's based on my belief that this holds in nod, which is not itself 100%. Okay. This holds in nod, that belief is now 100%.
Okay.
But yeah, so my suspicion is that this will just be spinning wheels in nod rather than making any concrete change, but needs to be looked at and not something I've thought about.
All right, thanks. Sorry for taking so much of your time.
No, that's super helpful.
As you know, we in Buenos Aires connect files of cats with the paraconsistent aspect of the logic. In particular, because there are some connection with files of metamodus ponens and this type of stuff. And so my question is, in the project of capture classical logic, where is the role of the place that we have to take with safe instances of cats? Because not all instances of cat are connected with paraconsistent or something like that. So if we want to capture classical logic, maybe one concern is what happens with cats or transitivity in cases where transitivity is okay.
Yeah, so this is a question about just kind of classical recapture in this different setting, in this sort of non-transitive setting. I mean, it depends on the non-transitive setting that you're in, but if you're in an ST kind of non-transitive setting where it's just relies on certain classical flavors of what's going on in ST, the idea is to say that, in some sense, cuts, just like invalid arguments frequently have valid instances, invalid argument forms frequently have valid instances. Invalid meta-rule forms or non-validity preserving meta-rule forms often have instances that preserve validity. And so the explanatory thing here is so the question now is not to explain the success of thinking that all classically valid arguments are valid, because that's just truth. There's no need to explain that success, other than the need we always have to explain the success of truthing. But there is the need to explain the success of cutting, right? Because there's this practice of reasoning transitively, and that's had a lot of success too. And right, so the explanatory problem arises not necessarily about recapturing classical validities, but about recapturing this reasoning transitively. And the response is to say that all that success is in cases where we have validity-preserving instances of this schema that isn't in general validity-preserving. And why are these validity-preserving instances? Right, it's not just like, oh, that drops out of the sky ad hoc. Genson's cut elimination proof actually shows us why those instances preserve validity, or actually I think that Katabimbo's modification of Genson's proof is the right explanatory story for why these instances of the usual ones in the logical language are validity preserving. Genson he proved that they were. Also, his proof is very, very close to the true explanation. But I think that Katabimbo's proof, actually, she's got it. That's the explanation right there. So it's not, I think, this sort of, oh, just those instances are fine because they are, but it's in fact, we have an explanatory proof for why those instances are fine. That does not extend to the cases that are not fine. So that's the kind of story I would want to spin there. But all that kind of has in common with this sort of approach is this sort of deep explanatory question. And I think even the things to be explained are different between the cases, because here they're concerned to explain the success of classical validities, whereas in that sort of case, that's the easy part, and then there's this other explanatory question.
First of all, what is the Katabimbo proof? Where is the Katabimbo proof?
I forget the name of the article it's first in, but it's in her book Proof Theory. Okay. She presents it very clearly there. The only difference with Genson's proof is she gets rid of this mixed garbage and handles contraction with an additional coordinate to the induction measure. And so I think she developed it actually for a elimination proof for some kind of combinatorial logic involving the Y combinator. I think that's where she first published the technique, but she's extended it to other things. But anyway, you're counting how many times contraction has been applied rather than just sort of running roughshod over it all, the way that Genson does. And otherwise, it's exactly like Genson's proof. I mean,
that was not my question, but
okay.
Because you promised in the beginning that you were also kind of, at least you seem to wait that you were going to explain why classical logic conflated these operators. Like, why these two operators became one in classical logic instead of two others. And at least it's you seem to suggest that there was, but you didn't.
Yeah. So I can try to say something. I don't know that I actually have a great deal to say. I regret any suggestion that I would say anything in detail. But here are some things not in detail. And I think it comes back to the initial exchange with Lavinia, right? Which is, if you're coming from a classical mindset about what validity is, so I'm here inhabiting. Let me put on my non-contractivist hat, right? Because that's the hat with which I assert that classical logic conflates this. I don't assert it unhatted, but hat on, I assert that it conflates this. And the reason is the classical logicians have assumed that contraction is validity preserving, and they've assumed that dilution is validity preserving, falsely. But they've assumed it. And if you do make those assumptions, then, well, these things are equivalent to each other, right? Then the distinction that you're blurring is a mere notational distinction. Or, it's whatever distinction things that have different primitive rules but the same derivable rules for each other in a proof system might have, which is not much of a distinction at all. So you would think, oh, that's the kind of distinction that's a mere syntactic distinction. It's always harmless to ignore this distinction. We just have two notations for the very same idea. So conflation, I think it's very important to understanding conflation, that it is not always a mistake. There are all kinds of distinctions that are not worth the trouble it takes to draw, right? That we could draw that really are tracking something that just don't matter. And so if you think that contraction and dilution are validity preserving, then you're going to think, look, the distinction here is a distinction that matters basically never, right? It matters when we're doing certain aspects of proof theory. But otherwise, right, the meanings of the things it all comes out in the wash. So it if contraction and dilution were validity preserving, it would be an eminently justifiable conflation.
But the way you're saying it now, it sounds like conflation is a kind of abstraction, right? Oh, you disregard circle difference and you just say something more general. But that is not what's happening here, because it is not that the classical rules are more general than the linear or the A or Taylor rules. They are just,
Well, I mean, in some sense they are, right? So from your classical rules plus these things, all the linear and affine rules are derivable.
okay, so it's that kind of generality, kind of a conditional generality, right? Because if those things were true, then this would be a more general truth.
Yes, yeah.
But possibly is that you also promise that classical logicians.
I've been promising a lot.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, you promise a lot. You promise like, oh yeah, they're going to be right. It's just disambiguation. But then, of course, they're not right because there is no such thing as the operator they're talking about. So
okay.
Laws are. I mean, if you read the law, of course it's false because
disagree. Totally
because,
disagree.
Because it's general. It's a generalization. So it's saying for all blah 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 about this, but there is no such thing as all this because there are so many different. For them it works. For some of them it works. For other ones it doesn't. So the generalization is actually false.
Okay, so this is to reject the desideratum that I'm calling inferential charity.
Okay.
Right. This is to say that look, once conflation gets in play, then this is false because conflated. But I don't think that at all.
No.
I think all kinds of conflated utterances are true.
But
So
also the classical logicians, the claims, the validity claims of the classical logicians in particular, but not the general laws. Every particular instance, of course, you can disambiguate it and it becomes, oh yeah, what they mean is this and it's valid. But the general laws.
what do you mean by the general laws?
I don't know.
I mean, if you think of so take an argument like this, right? So this is linearly valid. This is not linearly valid.
Yeah.
And now we have this classical argument. And now we wonder, is that argument classically valid or not? And this is a whole schema, right? This is a law.
I get it.
And my answer is yes, that is valid. It's not valid and not, it's not some blend, that validity is not undermined by this. Rather, its validity is guaranteed by this, regardless of what happens here. And so if laws means like argument schemes even, then I think every classical one this is still with my non-contractivist hat on, every classical one comes out absolutely in the clear.
Yes, you're right.
Because it suffices for it to be okay that there is some underlying one that's okay, and there really always is, even for the schemes.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you can make your question like super quick, maybe more exquisite.
So I just had a finger on this. I think I realized what I wanted to say, and what I want to say is that why not projecting everything from the beginning by saying that the inference. So what I wanted to say with my example was that sometimes we need to pack some of the logic in the definition, right? So the thing is flawed from the beginning because there are some inferences that were part of the meaning of conjunction that you are rejecting. But to make this really precise, I need more time. So I think.
And I depending on the precision, but I suspect my response will be essentially the same, which is to say, look, did you mean this sort of inference? Because that's here, and so on and so on and so on. I think that will be at least the avenue I would try in response, but of course it'll all depend on the details.
Yeah, I know. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.